help many constituents understand these topics.
Sounds good. And Dr. Kong, yeah, definitely hoping that it's a once in a century event and not to be repeated during my lifetime, hopefully. Peter, on to you. Tell us a bit more about, all of us are crossing fingers and knocking on woods. So Peter, tell us a bit more about what is Seek Asia's, role in the development of this report, and what kind of unique perspectives do you think Seek was able to bring to this, especially as a tech company?
Yeah, so we've been partnering with BCG and others for 7 years, as Dr. Kong said, to produce a linear set of reports over time that are quite core to what we do. We own JobStreet, JobsDB. Broader Seek Group has stakes in 25 startups around the world, including things like Coursera, FutureLearn, Go1, Employment Hero. And so our mission is to help people's productive working lives. And this gets to the core of our mission. And more importantly, it allows us to match the trends that we're seeing in Asia from our everyday operations here in Asia to the global trends. And that helps our hires find talent, and it helps our candidates find jobs.
Right. Thanks, Peter. And, so reading through the reports, I thought it was really interesting because you had such large data sets and you kind of really dove into what was on top of people's minds. In terms of before we dive into some of the stats that I saw that were interesting, what do you think are some of the biggest emerging themes from the reports? And, were there any that you're like, wow, this is really surprising, or were they all in line with your expectations?
To be honest, I was surprised, and the thing which surprises to me the most, and this is beyond the 3 questions, is how quickly things change. So I was really impressed by the nature in which we saw shifts in response over time, just in a year. So kind of people know what they want, and that really was something which kind of opened my eyes. I think if we go down a level underneath, I think looking at changes in mobility, the idea of emerging interest to do remote work is, I think, pretty much a big trend. The fact that people really do want to go back to something different in terms of the way of working, a hybrid working model, whatever form that might take, I think it's very loud and clear. And I think the last thing which I would say is what struck me somewhat is actually people are quite willing to reskill and learn. I think this pandemic has put a lot of pressure on people, but they're willing to actually learn and become a different type of contributor to the companies, societies, and also communities. So I think that's actually quite heartening.
Thanks, Dr. Kong.
I think for me, there's a lot of media and talk about COVID being an accelerator, and all it is doing is accelerating trends. And for me, the most, I don't know if you'd call it surprising, but the most wow feature is to really see in the data the acceleration of every single linear trend that we've been doing this report for 7 years. So pretty much, if you were to take any trend and it goes like this, there's a kink, and it probably brought forward trends 3, 4, 5 years in some cases, and it's astonishing to see in data. And so it's not that any particular trend was surprising, but what is surprising is the rate of change to the trend in just the period of COVID. It's really been quite striking.
I know. I mean, who would have thought that, we'd all be working from home? And there were so many companies that used to be like, no, this job cannot be performed from home. And now it's just the new norm, right? And I definitely want to dive more into some of the points that you shared deeper. So Dr. Kong, I saw that, this is actually quite a large set of data, and you've got people from all over the world responding, which is great for representation. So how did you actually select these respondents to ensure that, it's a fair representation of what people are thinking?
Look, I think I would just give the rather straightforward answer. Representation is always an issue, right? Anytime you do a survey, you always have representation issues at some level. I think here, what helps in terms of representativeness is that it's a global process. We've over like 200 and close to 210,000 kind of respondents with many kind of participants inside the network who we've collaborated with to really get a sample of this. I think for us, it's not perfect. We don't argue that it's necessarily 100% representative, but it's large enough that we can kind of start to infer what is a regional trend versus what's a universal truth, and that type of analysis we're able to do because the sample sizes are so big, and we're also able to understand broadly what are differences across regions, across ages, across hierarchies. I think these things, given the sizes that we have and the reach that's been achieved, are actually quite doable. But I wouldn't argue that it's perfectly representative for every company in every geography, because clearly it's impossible.
Yeah, that's true. And speaking of the regional trends and the differences that you mentioned, Peter, so in terms of, in Tech in Asia's Decoding Global Talent video, you actually mentioned that there were some interesting differences between geographies when it comes to, where, how, and what kind of work people want to do. In Southeast Asia in particular, the greatest difference is in the preference for remote working. Could you help us dive into that a little bit more on what people are thinking and why you think these differences exist?
Yeah, I think just before we jump into remote working, one of the points I wanted to make, actually, because I look at the data and I kind of, as a person who's led a global career or living in many different continents and countries, I get kind of concerned about is there's a dramatic acceleration in the decrease of people willing to work and wanting to work overseas. And now there's two aspects to that. One, that has been a trend since the beginning of the survey. So if you look at 2014 and then 2016 and then 2018 and 2020, you've seen it continuously, globalization and willingness to work globally go down, down, down. And it jumped up dramatically, or came down dramatically, if you will, in 2020. And that it gets to a lot of trends, I think, globally, trends against immigration, more nationalistic trends, and that, I think, for anybody who leads a global career, and for tech companies who seek to build global or regional businesses, some very interesting thoughts come to mind. So that's the first thing, and that's pretty consistent around the geographies, right? So now, when you double click into that, what you see is there's a big correlation in GDP per capita and your willingness either to retrain or work overseas. So and then because Southeast Asia is so diverse, you generally see Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia quite flexible. They want to retrain. They're a little bit more willing to move overseas, a little bit more willing to work for remote companies, work remotely in their country than, say, a Singapore or a Malaysia. So as you have many businesses now building across Southeast Asia, really important to keep in mind the differences in talent and the needs and desires of the talent relative to where that talent is based. And because what a skilled worker will want and might be open to in Singapore would be very different than a skilled worker in the Philippines, for example.
That's really interesting insights, because I guess when, if you're looking at data from 10, 20 years ago, everyone was the best talent in a lot of these countries would leave away somewhere and then they would work, they would make their money, and maybe when it's time to retire, they might come back. But now we're seeing a lot more young people want to stay in their countries and build for their countries. And I guess a lot of these markets are also quite attractive. Indonesia is booming in the e-commerce sector, etc. Peter and Dr. Kong, one of the points that you alluded to earlier was this topic of remote work, right? And I think that's a huge trend that we saw last year. For some companies, it came a bit naturally, especially if they had more flexible arrangements. For some companies, it was basically forced on them. In your report, we saw that 89% of the respondents actually wanted more flexibility with their work, and 24% wanted a fully remote experience. Now, I have a question for you that I'm sure a lot of talent directors are probably dealing with. Many companies actually have location-adjusted salaries. For example, if you work in the same job for the same company, you're going to be earning differently if you are based in SF versus Singapore versus Jakarta. So what does this mean? With remote work being more desirable, how do you think companies should actually benchmark salaries, and where does location matter now?
Maybe let me take a start on
yeah,
this
go
one.
ahead.
I think for many employees, it's going to be a bit of a work in progress. Let me break it down into two. I think if you do it from the start, i.e., plan for a distributed workforce from the beginning, and I think this is for smaller kind of mid-sized companies that might be starting up. You can plan for, say, uniform salaries. And you get people from across the world. So that's one pathway to actually tap into a distributed kind of remote type model from the beginning. Now, the greater challenge, and I think this is to your question on benchmarking, is if you're a large established company, how do you do it, right? I would say step by step, because large established companies, typically, they do have a number of challenges in terms of, take in tech, I don't know, someone like Facebook. Facebook actually has made some progress in this, looking at, people, say, US, Canada, UK, they're able to, be in one location and do jobs in any of those locations. So they're trialing out schemes. But I think companies here really do have to think about, from a kind of a very administrative perspective, how do we have an equal salary in these places? How do we handle the taxation, the contracting? Because they have to work with the rules of the countries that they're employing these people by. I don't think that's a perfect answer. I think people are trying to figure it out, but it's possible to start thinking about that and putting it into play. I mean, if you think about the cost of living in some of these places, I don't know, San Francisco, in your question, yeah, it's really tough. It'd be great to live somewhere else and then, get San Francisco salary. Fully understand that.
Yeah, like live on an island and then be getting SF salaries.
Live in Bali, get SF salary.
And Peter, from your perspective,
so Aziza,
tell us a bit more.
Yeah, so as you set up the question, you referenced the 24% want to work remotely. The way I like to interpret that particular statistic is it means 3/4 of employees don't want to work remotely. So 75%, 76% will want either some on-site work or all on-site work, right? So I think it's important that companies keep in mind that 3/4 of people still want an office-based environment in some way, shape, or form. Not all the time, but most employees still value, probably as much as the employer does, the role of face-to-face working. Having said that, to address your question in particular, what we see happening more and more is two trends. Firstly, role-based judgment calls on where you want global talent versus regional talent versus local talent, right? So if you want to hire, and we see this of some of the decacorns in Southeast Asia, you want to hire, a top tier VP of engineering. That's a global. You want to make a global search for that. You're going to pay global salaries for that, right? But equally, an accountant, say, in your finance team in the Philippines, you may just want to run a country-based search for that. So it's very role-based. That's the first point. And then the second point, particularly for the regional and global roles, the role of data and benchmarking to really understand where the market is playing a very, very large and increasingly large part. We ourselves, we have 1,000 people at various levels all across Asia We ourselves are really seeking, and no pun intended, great quality benchmark data to understand the market and understand where pay is and where the quartiles break.
Thanks, Peter. I'm guessing that's not the first time you've used that pun.
No. You brought here one or two more times. Yes.
Love that. So both of you have talked about, how companies should think about when it comes to benchmarking salaries, like fairly, location specific, etc. Given that 89% of people want some form of flexibility, Dr. Kong, is there any other suggestions that you would give to employers on how to create an environment that allows more flexibility, and what does that actually mean?
Look, I think flexibility means that there are many different forms of flexibility, I think, for employers, and especially when we look at, employers looking at people's well-being, right? They actually map out kind of different aspects of the employee's journey, and to see, where are there changes, where can they support, and what type of flexibility there is. And this is things such as, parental leaves for both, fathers and mothers, being, a bit more progressive, and paying for those well in excess of what might be mandated by law in a particular location. Looking at things such as for parents, and I think kind of paying for care, right? As particular schemes. So people look at, and this is just in the a particular subset, but actually going through the profiles of your employees and really breaking it down and seeing what areas can flexibility really change the experience and make people feel supported. I think that's actually something which we see companies doing a lot more of, and a lot more of in these kind of pandemic and post-pandemic times.
Right, thank you. And Peter, do you have anything to add from what you're seeking from both the job seeker side of things and the employer side of things?
Yeah, I mean, just to zone in on this particular region, the flexibility is almost, and I suspect will be for another year or so, 100% dependent on the COVID situation in that city, in that country, at that moment, and it is going to vacillate in and out of waves. And so we ourselves employ a spectrum. Everything from, we have cities, for example, I'm in Sydney right now, complete lockdown. Places like Jakarta, most of the cities in Southeast Asia right now are some form of lockdown. Then you've got cities like Melbourne, which is now allowing back to work, right? Which where our regional headquarters is, right? Or our global headquarters. And so the spectrum typically goes for us in lockdown, no one, and it's all fully remote, obviously. When it's kind of that in-between state, and it's going to be that way for many geographies for quite some time, we empower the employee individual to make the call based on their own personal safety, right? So if they feel safe coming back into the office, we want the employee first and foremost to feel safe, right? So then, as economies and COVID situation stabilizes, gone are the days, we believe, of 5 days a week working in the office. It's going to be a mix. We have taken the choice to empower individual team managers to make the call as to what days are appropriate in the office and keep the team cohesion together. And each company is going to try its own way, right? So obviously, if you're a manufacturing company or a service-based company, you need to be there for physical presence reasons. But beyond that, knowledge-based workers, we do not see 5 days a week for knowledge-based work coming back anytime soon.
Thanks, Peter. I like that you brought up like the impact of COVID and how it's going to impact some of these decisions. I'm actually going to jump to a question that we had later in the line because I think it ties in nicely with this. Especially over the past year, mental health has been at the forefront of like many employer conversations, right? What we went through last year was a normal remote work. We were like working from home in the middle of a pandemic. And in the report, you actually suggested that employers should provide mental health offering, and they should think about measuring stress levels, design well-being programs. So Dr. Kong and Peter, what are some of the resources that employers can actually tap on for this? And I have another question, around this. Many of the Tech in Asia audience that are watching are either founders or they're running early stage startups where, there's a certain amount of like a hustle mentality that's kind of expected in order to succeed. But how do you balance this with also making sure that your team isn't burning out and quitting on you? Like how do you balance both of those things?
I might take this one first. So firstly, this is a topic we at Seek very passionate about internally. In Seek in Asia, so our personal perspective is it's hard in general for any tech company to grapple with this challenge. I'll get to your start question point in a moment, but in an Asia context, no, it is quite difficult to talk about these issues, right? So before we even get to the resources, we spend a lot of time talking to the team managers and the individual people managers. It is super important you coach them on how to ask questions about how people are. The typical, like, how are you going? You're going to get 9 times out of 10, I'm fine. You're not going to get a deep response. It is really important. The frontline information is that people manager going 2 questions, 3 questions, 4 questions. Yeah, how's it at home? How the family stresses? Is everything okay with the kids? Right? So those are uncomfortable questions or unusual questions to ask in a normal context, right? So it starts with the people manager, and the amount of coaching and the amount of emphasis that we're trying to place on people managers in one-on-ones to really make sure it's not just the cursory question. That's the front line. If you don't get that front line right, you could provide all the resources and they'll never be used. Beyond that, the resources are super critical. Whether it is independent help, be it independent confidential helplines, people for them to see or Zoom, or more structured support included in the health plan. So now we're moving to include mental health as part of our health plan. So there's a variety of resources out there, but what we found is the hardest part is cracking that front line. And I think in Asia it's doubly hard, and in Asia in tech it's triply hard. I ran a startup all across Asia for 5 years, and we worked our butts off, and it was kind of we wore it as a badge of honor, right? So and I will tell you, that does not work in COVID. It just flat doesn't work. So for the founders listening, put those issues aside for the next year, right? You've got to lean in, people first, and it's counterintuitive. It goes against some, cultural DNA in tech, but you must do that way because you have no idea what people are dealing with at home. And that's just, if you care about your people long term, you must invert it, and you gotta start leaning in on these mental health issues.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think definitely more and more companies should be including mental health in their employee benefits. In fact, many insurance companies now include therapy as part of it if you buy the right plan. Dr. Kong, could you tell us a little bit more about, what are some of the resources that employers can tap into? And for some of the TIA subscribers watching from home, how can they have these conversations with their team while still trying to have like a high-performing team during this period, right? Like, how do you balance those?
So I don't think it's a balance, and I don't think it's a trade-off for a start. I mean, in BCG, we have, for quite a while, actually had a pretty systematic approach in which we understand, on a weekly basis, how each of our teams are doing relative to their well-being. And it's somewhat anonymized within the team. So actually, you don't know, it's the team that, sets up this survey. The survey comes in, it's set up, people discuss it. And we've encouraged our leaders to actually, really double and triple down on this, and to have those conversations one-on-one, but also, within the team setting, to know that teams feel supported and can access help if they need it through these times. So there is no trade-off, because inside a way of working which actually removes a lot of the connectivity that we've taken for granted, pre-COVID, people are looking for that, and these types of measures actually help maintain and enhance performance. So I would first of all say that there's no trade-off. Now, as to the specific question of tools that are available, I think you've got really tools in two classes. One is actually around establishing a baseline, getting data on this, and people go through a range. There are companies that have they started initially, going for surveys. There are people that have done group health monitoring, so that you can even get Fitbit type data, just to get a sense of stress levels and stuff. But it's I think that there's a series of pretty well used tools to assess how your teams are doing, how where there are likely problem areas. Now, then you get into the range of interventions, right? Potential interventions. It can be, kind of employee assistance programs, scaling those up, making those broadly available. There can be access to mental health and kind of experts, and health insurance should be adjusted to cover that if necessary. It's a small and easy fix, but it's also, I think there are tools around internal leadership that it is okay not to be okay, and I think this element of leaders, founders in the cases of startups saying, hey, it's okay not to be okay. We can then work together to become more okay. I think that conversation, there's also leadership tools that are quite important to be deployed inside discussing the challenges that many of us have faced in these times. So it's multiple levers to pull at the same time, but I think it's a worthwhile investment, especially given the variability that we're all likely to experience in Asia in the coming months and years ahead, as we start to emerge from the pandemic.
Yeah, and I love that you said, it's okay for leaders and team members to know that it's okay not to be okay for, and to say that this doesn't have to be a trade-off. I'm just gonna tell our audience who are watching this from home, please do ask your questions in the chat boxes. The Tech in Asia team is going to be taking those questions, and they're going to be curating them and sharing them with me so that I can ask Peter and Dr. Kong during our chat. I want to shift gears a little bit into another area of the report that, we saw. It's basically, we're kind of like seeing a lot of impact on the effects of COVID and automation in terms of like the kind of desired jobs. Dr. Kong, what do you think the reports are revealing about the shifts towards upskilling, and what are some of these desired types of jobs that you're seeing?
Three things here: the impact of COVID, the threat of automation, and people retraining. So first of all, on COVID, it's quite clear that COVID has had a negative impact on people and their jobs. I think 36% of respondents said they were either laid off or at risk or having their working hours reduced. So I think we can't understate this. It has had an impact, and related to this, as people have had to work under a COVID situation on automation, 41% of people in the survey actually said that they feel that their jobs are under threat of being automated, and people are aware of this. People really do see this either directly or they perceive it. And actually, this is particularly prominent in Asia. compared to Europe. When we look at the geographical distributions, you can argue in Europe there's more worker protections, but this is something that is very, very, very evident. Now, in terms of where people want to go to, I think retraining is really key. And what really surprised me was, 70% of people are really willing to retrain, to shift into careers, to learn new skills. And what was interesting in terms of correlations in the data is that people in areas at risk of automation, customer services, admin type roles, sales roles, were most willing to retrain. So they felt, they felt these risks, they felt it potentially as a result. And interestingly, for our geography, people also in developing economies had a higher willingness actually to make these switches, compared to more developed economies. And it also shows a sense of willingness to adapt. So, I think from the survey results, we clearly see there is a lot of interest from workers to do this. Now, the next step, which is clearly outside of the realm of the report, is for governments, companies, associations within different geographies and locations to really pick up on this interest and start to provide the tools such that people can actually do this. So I think that is the next step that needs to happen.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's definitely a trend that we're seeing at GA as well. We had a record number of people join some of our courses last year. And also, I think there's been a shift in employers' mindsets when it comes to hiring. I remember when I first set up the company here 6 years ago, employers were like, no, I'm not going to take someone who's reskilled. And now they're moving more into skills-based hiring. Peter, segueing from that, the report covers trends around retraining and learning on the job. Well, this is all important. Like, Dr. Kong mentioned how individuals are very motivated. We're seeing governments start to do more and more in this area. We also need employers to be more open to hiring retrained workers. Are you actually seeing employers being more open to skills-based hiring versus paper qualifications? For example, I think there was like this funny tweet where it was about this job posting that was asking for X years of experience in a particular programming language. And the guy who actually founded that language, wrote that language, was like, I don't have that many years of experience because the language hasn't been around for that many years. While these make for funny tweets and Twitter moments, this actually impacts real people, who maybe not be selected for that first round of interview because they don't have that many years of experience, but they have the skills. What are your thoughts around this, and what advice would you give to employers?
So first of all, I think this is a market-based issue across Asia, because I think hirers are very open to the concept of skills-based hiring. Candidates want to show and demonstrate they have those skills, but the issue is certification, believability. I know Microsoft Excel, but I haven't built a model in 20 years. So, what do I could say I know Microsoft Excel, but what does that really mean? So whether it is certification that you indeed graduated from institution X, or you have level of skill Y, this is something the market across Asia is really developing at pace. So, I mean, you guys are doing a General Assembly, a lot of great stuff. We bought a company called Certsy to certify certain things into people's qualifications beyond just your education and your past employment. I think one of the biggest opportunities across Asia right now is figuring out how to solve this problem of certifying that somebody has a skill to a certain level and providing that confidence to the employer or the hirer that yes, they do have that skill. It is at a certain level. It is a very real thing. If we can solve that, we're working very, very hard within the SEEK group on a number of different strategies to solve this issue. We definitely see the willingness on the hire side. We see the willingness on the job seeker side. It's just a market failure issue right now that we're trying to work very, very hard. And many startups around the region are trying to do the same.
That sounds really promising, at least that there's that willingness. And now what we need to figure out are the tools and the systems to kind of make it happen. All right, and the other part of the report that kind of stood out to me was around diversity, equity, and inclusion. 68.7% of your respondents for the survey thought that diversity and inclusion was important to them. Do you think companies do enough in this regard? For example, I think one of you mentioned that there's less employment protection laws in some of these countries, right? And also, for example, in Singapore, there are very few anti-discriminatory employment laws. Many employers tend to ask their candidates, "Hey, what was your previous salary?" And they tend to base their offers on that. We've seen that there are reports that say that this widens the gender gap. So how do we deal with all of these when there isn't legislation in place? What can employers do better to create an environment that's actually diverse and equitable? You can share both from what you're seeing your organizations do, whether that's ERGs, etc., or what you're seeing your peers in the industry do. Dr. Kong, do you want to go first?
Yep.
Oh, sorry, Peter, you unmuted my mic. You can go first if you want. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Dr. Kong, go ahead. Go ahead, Dr. Kong. All you.
Sure, I will follow Aziza's lead on this. She's the boss. So look, diversity and inclusion is incredibly important when it comes to the topic of getting talent, getting the right talent, and retaining the right talent, inside your organization. I think there's a range of measures that companies can take. I think in BCG, we have actually pretty comprehensive programs and statistics that we programs that we run, statistics that we track, to really ensure that we are trying to build as inclusive a talent pool as possible, and to retain that. So in some ways, we call it let me give you an example of a program. We call it BCG Ally, and here we're looking at the purpose of the program is that we believe that allies can effectively promote change, raise awareness, and advocate essentially for underrepresented identities within the organization. And there are different types of allies. There's men as allies, for instance, for gender diversity. So looking at, for instance, our women at BCG, sponsoring certain groups, calling out gendered thinking and terminology. So it's very practical. Some of these dialogues. We have pride allies, for the LGBTQ community, and this is around. There are many things here, pronouns, the language and terminology, really understanding spectrum. So it's building awareness, but also trying in our day-to-day to really coach BCGers to be more sensitive, to be more inclusive in how they interact with each other. So I think there are programs that can be deployed. We deploy quite a few, but we also track our outcomes. We look at our pools. So for instance, on gender, I think 40% of our recruits are actually women. We look at differential retention rates, say by gender as a cut. I'm happy that retention rates are the same for both genders. So you can start to see the programs actually having some impact. And you look also at progression. I think we have 40% as intake. 35% of our executive committee are actually women, which is great on the gender diversity front. We can do better, and I think that there is this idea that you can still always get better with diversity and inclusion. So I think it's many programs. It's also tracking towards outcomes, it takes time. We've been running these programs for a while, so I would get started because these things take a bit of time, and over time, when you do it and people see it as part of the reason why they join you. So I've had many colleagues who I interact with, and they say, hey, this is part of the reason why I joined and part of the reason why I stay. So, I can, at least from our own experience, I can highly encourage it.
Yeah, I think it's definitely so important for attracting and retaining great talent. And I love that you had the concept of allies and sponsors. Those are so important, for people, especially from underrepresented groups, to get ahead. Peter, what about you? What are some things that you are doing at Seek? And also, Seek has a huge influence on how, employers think as well. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, at Seek, we're generally pretty proud of where we've gotten to in Asia. So 55% of our workforce in Asia are female, and we've got more work to do at certain levels, particularly more senior levels. We've got work to do in Asia, but even at the global level, Seek has always been a very front forward leading diversity and inclusion advocate. Now, some of the things we do and we encourage. So first of all, we believe data and sunshine on the data solves a lot of these issues. Every single town hall, we report the gender mix in Seek Asia. Every single town hall, we report the gender mix of new hires that particular month to see how it's changing. Every HR review, we track attrition by diversity group. And then within Seek, more broadly speaking, in Australia and globally, support groups are really important for underrepresented groups or groups that have historically had challenges. And we welcome that, we encourage that. And last but not least, it's from the group CEO, Improv on down, is a very important thing to lead from the front. You have to talk about it. You have to say it matters. You have to show it matters. And the only way to change it is you lean into the problem. You show you're making progress. It cannot be solved easily if it's an established company with many, many years or decades of hiring built up. But you've got to show consistent progress. And it's kind of table stakes today for a modern, well-run team and well-balanced team and organization. Most people of Gen Z and millennials, they want to work for teams like that. So that's you just got to do it.
People want to work for places that they know care about them, make them feel included, and where they're going to be able to grow their careers. And Peter, you kind of touched on the fact that this has to come from top down. The CEO has to be talking about this. On the topic of, what a CEO looks like, we've seen a shift in what people expect of leaders, especially public facing leaders right at the top in the past few years. As a CEO yourself, do you think COVID and some of the recent, social movements have brought forward a new type of CEO? And what kind of characteristics do you think the CEO has now?
So I think the way to answer that is no, it's not really introducing a new type of CEO. It's just weeding out the crap, right? So there's very little space for just BS anymore, right? The whole bombastic CEO thing, like who's got time for that now, right? We're all stressed and under pressure, and COVID's horrible, and all that. I think COVID's accelerated the weed out effect of bad CEOs, and that to me is a good trend out of COVID, right? The more we can kind of weed out the dead wood from the past and some of the older style of leading teams, I think the better.
Love that. Dr. Kong, before we move into the audience Q&A, and thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your questions. We're going to be running into that. Are there any practices or insights that you feel that this report, has given you that you're going to be recommending to some of your clients when you're undertaking new projects, or anything that our audience should be taking note of?
I think for us, there are probably two things that we take into our client conversations and client discussions that we're engaged with. The first is really rethink the future of work. From the trends that emerge around people being less willing to do mobility, more interested in remote working, the future of work is going to be quite different to what it was previously. And the more thoughtful they are, the sooner they embark on the journey, the better they're going to be able to win in the market. And there is actually, as markets open, tremendous competition for talent. And you already see data points emerging out of the US and parts of Europe, where there's actually lots of hiring. So, you better be ready because people are coming after your talent. So that's one thing that we discuss a lot. The second thing is actually thinking about kind of the culture that companies want to create in a detailed and meaningful way. We touched on the topic of inclusion, diversity. I think these are things that it's time to relook at really what is the culture of the company and how is it being lived, because there have been many beautiful culture statements written in the past, but COVID has really challenged what has the company delivered relative to what it's written. So rethinking that and actually, if necessary, readjusting to deliver on the type of environment that you've promised, I think is also something that we've talked a lot about with our clients. So actually plenty of food for thought, so to say, inside this report that are very, very pressing issues with the leaders that we deal with and speak with.
Yeah, this is super helpful, especially for people who are building their teams, trying to gain insights into, what makes good talent want to come to your company and how do you retain them. So moving into the audience Q&A, one of the things that we talked about during this segment was also, one of you mentioned generational differences. So we have a question from Nilesh Jadhav. He's asking, like in the report, how and to what degree are generational trends factored in? For example, when Gen Zs come into the workforce in a few years, they were born with a slightly different set of conditions. They were born with like mobile phones, and they have slightly different, approaches to what they might want from employers. They're in the gig economy. They're looking at like social media hiring. And someone also mentioned that TikTok just launched their video resumes app this week. So did generation actually play a part in how you saw the data in the report?
I might jump in just on that. One of the more interesting things for me with seeing the data was seeing the that age bracket didn't matter as much as I thought it would, right? So for example, willingness to retrain by age group, yeah, it does skew a little bit. So like 70% of 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds, right? So that decade, right, are willing to retrain. But guess what? In the 50 to 60 bracket, 54% are willing to retrain. In the over 60 bracket, 53% are willing to retrain. So yeah, there are some differences. The differences are much more striking based on job category, what job you are now, how impacted your job is now, right? Relative versus age. And so I think particularly in some of the geographies like Singapore or Hong Kong or Australia, in the region where you're going to be facing a wave of older workers, I think some of the biases or preconceived ideas of, whoa, those old workers and what are they willing to do, or how they're not really that flexible, is got to be totally debunked, because it's just not as stark as you would think. It's much more to do about what job do you have now? Is your job needed? If it's not needed, your willingness to change, doesn't matter how old you are, still there.
Sounds good. And Dr. Kong, do you have any insights on that? Or we can move on to the next question. We've got quite a few.
So I'll just make a small add. I think from a company perspective, the generational trends need to be factored in, be it whether you're serving that generation as a customer, or if you're if that talent pool is one that you really want to access, then you need to think about how those trends actually matter, just to make it as easy as possible to access the talent, right? That you're looking to access. So, from a company perspective, I think if it makes sense to do it, absolutely factor it in. But in terms of people's preferences, I'm fully with Peter. It's actually quite stark in the results that age doesn't seem to have. It's not the strongest determinant, actually, of some of the trends.
Thank you for sharing that. And, you mentioned earlier, Dr. Kong, that it's okay not to be okay. And we have a question from Rachel on this topic. She says, is there a tool or concept that you've considered when you mention interventions in the workplace? Peter, you also talked about just now, how you would actually coach your leaders on the kind of questions to ask. Can you tell us what are some of the concepts and tools that you've considered? What are some things that employers can think about?
This is a very interesting question around improv, which is a very specific tool coming out of theater. Very, very powerful. I smile because it's actually one of the trainings that our leaders do. We get trained by people, from the theater world that actually teach us, some of these skills and how to keep building on each other's conversation. So absolutely, I think, skills of this nature, trainings of this nature that help you, build trust, inclusion are all, helpful. Improv, there are people there are service providers that do offer these trainings. By all means, access it. I think the more the merrier.
Great, thank you. And Peter, are there any other tools that you've found helpful when you're working with your teams?
I love this question. I love Dr. Kong's insight to how they do it at BCG. Look, what we're finding is, and we don't do enough of this at Seek. I think it's a very thought-provoking question. Young managers, and these are conversations about mental health, conversations of performance on Zoom. How do you fire someone over Zoom, right? So no one has been trained on this formally. So any sort of training where you have to act out and actually have to practice the skill and actually verbalize it in a safe training environment is going to be superb, right? So, and it's absolutely what's needed, because there is nothing that has been scripted in formal training modules that prepared us for this world, right? I thank the person who asked that question. It's very thought provoking, and I think it gets to the heart of something we all need to do a lot more of.
Yeah, and we're almost at the hour, so we're going to take our very final question. In terms of C-Law has this question. When you're recruiting for talent, what are some of the key points that you look at? If you're looking to hire someone. I'm guessing hard skills aside, is there anything that?
Yeah, I was gonna say. So there's a certain threshold. Yeah, there's a certain threshold of communication and skills that you just have to have for a given role, right? So that's just kind of a kind of given. So putting that aside, I think one of the things we look for at Seek are people who are really passionate about doing and helping our mission and purpose. I think more and more you hear that Gen Z and millennials really want to work for companies who have a purpose. Equally, I think more and more successful companies are those that are built around strong purposes. And so that match for us matters a lot. We come to work every day. My job is to help people get jobs. And at the end of every day, every seeker who comes to Seek has a bit of that motivation in them. And so we look for that alignment of, do you want to help build the same thing that we're building, and do you want to help people's lives and help people find jobs? And if that comes through and they have the skills, it makes a big difference.
Got that. So an alignment of mission and values. is important. What about you, Dr. Kong? What are some of the qualities that you look for in someone?
So, I interview many people through the for roles in BCG. I fully agree on the alignment with purpose. I mean, in BCG we have quite a clear view of our purpose. Unlocking the potential of those who are changing the world. So, if that excites people, please come and speak with us. But practically speaking, when you double click, then we get into things, more specific things. Problem solving. We love to solve problems at BCG. We like to create impact together with our clients, and there is also communications types of skills that are important. So there is plenty of things that we look for, but we ultimately look for that alignment with our purpose, and look forward to meeting hopefully many people, including probably some of the people on this webcast.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for sharing those insights with us, Peter and Dr. Kong. If you are interested in the report, just look for the Decoding Global Talent report. I'm sure the TIA team will be happy to share it with you as well. And thank you for being such a great audience and asking all of these questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get through to everybody's. We love having an engaged audience. And a huge thank you to both the Tech in Asia and the SEEK team for making this possible. Have a great weekend, everybody. And have fun dining in groups of 5 next week if you're in Singapore.
Thank you.
Bye, Aziza.
See ya.
Thank
Bye.
you.
You take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.